Okay, hi everybody. You should be able to see my presentation screen, hopefully. I'm going to try to tell you guys a little bit about living shorelines in this presentation. And the title of the presentation here is Green Infrastructure for Florida. So I'm going to start off by asking everybody a question. And basically, I'd like you to type into the chat just one thing that you know about living shorelines. And this isn't a test. Basically, I just want to try to find out what people know or think about living shorelines. By the end of the presentation, you'll find out why that's the case, but I don't want to give it away yet. It's just really for my information, just trying to figure out what everybody knows. So this is an example of a living shoreline that's in the Indian River Lagoon at Indian Riverside Park in Stuart, Florida. And so this is a county park. And you can see that this already had some vegetation on the shore. You can see some mangroves and some sea grape and a cabbage palm, but there was also a really big erosion problem in this area. And so the living shoreline was constructed here to try to help that out. And once we start to go further along in the presentation, you'll realize that what you're looking at here, you may know already, but these are oyster reefs, these curved elements that are out in the water. What is a living shoreline? I mean, we know that shorelines are alive if they have plants on them. But a living shoreline is a specific thing, and there's a definition. There's actually more than one definition for it. But the definition that I want to use is on the slide, and it is any shoreline management system that is designed to protect or restore natural shoreline ecosystems through the use of natural elements and, if appropriate, man-made elements. And we're going to learn about why a little later on. So there's certain goals here. And one of the principal ones is to restore natural shorelines in an effort to protect ecosystem services. So that covers a lot of stuff. The major thing it covers is a topic called resiliency. You know, we hear a lot about sea level rise and that sort of stuff. You know, it's a big problem for Florida. Florida is going to be one of the states that's the most impacted by that. And having a living shoreline can help our shorelines be more resilient and more responsive because they're not static. They actually can move along with sea level rise. So another thing about them is that the elements that are used in them can't interrupt the natural water and land continuum. So we want to maintain that connection between the land and the water. And just so you know, those of you who don't live on the water, they're not totally exclusive to coastal areas, because the same kinds of protections they provide and benefits they provide can work in non-tidal environments like creeks, rivers, lakes, and also in stormwater ponds. I want to try to connect living shorelines as a human construct with natural communities, because the things that we use in living shorelines are based on these communities. And right up front, I want to say that any place there's already a natural shoreline that performs natural functions, these things should not be replaced with construction projects, and they should be preserved and maintained. So when we're talking about living shorelines, we're not talking about these natural communities. And the three I'm going to talk about are salt marsh, mangrove forest, and inshore marine habitats. Initially, I was going to talk about both oyster reefs and seagrass, but in the interest of time, I'm only going to talk about oyster reefs. The first natural system we're going to look at is salt marsh, and so you can see some of the, so if you've been up to Cedar Key, you've seen these salt marshes. So lots of benefits with salt marshes, and a lot of these have to do with leaks, and they can support the shoreline and buffer that wave energy that's coming in, storm impact. They trap pollutants, keep sediments in place, and also provide a lot of, and actually the decomposing plants are a really important thing, because not only does that provide some food web support for the marsh itself, but it also gets distributed into the water where organisms can feed on it. So some of the plants that you're going to see are smooth cordgrass, Spartina alterniflora, salt meadow cordgrass, Spartina patens. And up in this upper right, that's sawgrass. We hear a lot about sawgrass in the Everglades, but it can also be a shoreline plant in other places. And black needle rush, and when you go around Cedar Key, you'll see these different colorations. And this juncus, black needle rush, gets to be really obvious when you're looking at those areas. In the mangrove forest, we've got 3 species of mangrove. We've got white, red, and black mangrove, and buttonwood, which technically isn't a mangrove, but it lives in that same, up in the back of that same habitat. And these are tropical species, so they don't really like freezes. And oddly, red mangrove can grow in fresh water, but typically it gets outcompeted by other plants. And so it's mostly considered a plant of the water's edge, exposed to tides and winds in areas that are at least partly salty. Having said that, I do know that it's up in the Loxahatchee River for those of you that live in the Jupiter area, and also up in the St. Lucie River in the South Fork of the St. Lucie River in Stewart. And so it can live in water that's fairly fresh. You can also, just for fun, you're allowed to pick up mangrove propagules off the beach, and if you want to take one home and grow it in an aquarium, you can grow that in fresh water. But if you plan to put it back out in the environment, I don't even know if you can do that. You probably shouldn't do that, but if you're growing mangroves in fresh water, I've heard that they don't transplant well back into saltwater. And they have these prop roots, and we're going to talk more about prop roots later on. So lots of life in the mangroves. This illustration in particular has to do with some of the life that's seen in deeper areas that have been created for flooding, flooding for mosquito control. But it shows some of the animals that are found in here. And it's a huge nursery area for all kinds of crustaceans, mollusks, and fish. And it supports other species that you wouldn't even think about. So like sea turtles spend part of their life in mangroves. There's also manatees use this to feed on. I've seen manatees actually eat the leaves from red mangrove. The key deer down on the Florida Keys uses this habitat, as does the American crocodile and birds. The brown pelican is one, but other birds use this also. And one really important thing about mangroves is that if you're a fisherman, 75% of our game fish are just totally dependent on this habitat for a part of their life cycles. So lots of benefits, and the benefits are somewhat similar to salt marsh benefits in terms of filtering pollutants and trapping sediment, stabilizing sediment, protecting shorelines from erosion. Also, these complicated spaces, like the aerial root system of the red mangrove, just like the marsh grass, makes lots of places for tiny little animals to live and hide. And the red mangrove in particular, the canopy, the root system, the hard or soft bottom that it's residing in, and the open water around it are all providing habitat. So this is a really, really amazing ecosystem that supports a lot of animals. So you're looking at, in this slide, you're looking at the 3 species of mangroves that we've got. The red mangrove on the upper left here with the aerial roots. And then the photo on the right is black mangrove. So that would be the one that grows. The red mangrove is the one that's closest to the water. The black mangrove would grow just slightly to the back of that. And it has these little stick-like snorkels that stick up called pneumatophores. And those help, both of these root systems help stabilize the plant. But there's also gas exchange going on and lots of interesting things that happen with mangroves, and with the ways that they deal with their tidal environment and also with dealing with salt. In the lower left photo, that's white mangrove, and will be back behind a little bit higher up slope and back behind the black mangrove. And then behind that is Conocarpus erectus, which is buttonwood. And if you look at buttonwood in nurseries, you're going to see it in the plant nursery. There's a couple of kinds. There's silver buttonwood, which kind of like our silver saw palmetto has that silvery leaf. And then there's green buttonwood, which is what I believe is in this picture. So to move on, inshore marine habitats. And so the one that I want to focus on here is the oyster reef. So oyster reefs are dense concentrations of mollusks that attach to a hard substrate. So their life history is pretty interesting. They reproduce by putting out their reproductive material into the water, and it mixes up because these are sessile animals. They can't move around. Once they attach to whatever they're attaching to, they're there permanently forever. And so once the little larvae get alive, then they can navigate around. They have cilia, so they can kind of swim around a little bit. And after a few weeks, they start to develop a foot, just like a conch or anything else. A mollusk has a foot, and also eye spots. And then they're able to look around for a place to attach. And I'm using the word look lightly because they sense places to attach, not like with eyes like we're looking around for, like we're looking for a meal. So they can also sense calcium carbonate in the water, and so that helps them find another oyster to stick on. And that's their favorite place to settle, is on another oyster shell. And so it becomes really critical that when we're doing living shorelines, that if we can, we put oyster reefs out there. Any place where there are oyster larvae in the water, if we put an oyster reef on it, these little guys are going to attach, and they're going to encapsulate, what we built, and they're going to form a reef, and they're going to really increase the amount of places for other animals to hide and live. So it's a big nursery ground, refugia, and foraging area for lots and lots of wildlife. Lots of benefits. I found this figure, and I think it's really amazing. So a square meter of oyster reef can actually encompass 50 square meters of surface area. And so inside these oyster reefs, there are all kinds of nooks and crannies and attachment points, create shelter for all kinds of other animals and some little plants. So some of the systems, the services they provide, they're filters, they're filter feeders, so they take in things like phytoplankton and bacteria, algae to some extent. They also will take in some sediment and contaminants in the water, and they filter out a certain amount of that. And there's a number you've probably heard that one adult oyster can filter 50 gallons of water a day. And that's absolutely true. That's not what every oyster is going to filter every single day, because it has somewhat to do with what's in the water. So for example, if you've got a big algae bloom, they're only going to take in so much, and then they're just going to close their shell up and wait. One of the things that they do when they take in this water is they actually can enhance the water clarity and create better water quality. So there's some relationship here. If we have a place where seagrass could naturally grow, and we build an oyster reef, and the oyster reef is successful, sometimes seagrass will actually start to recruit in these areas. And if you know anything about what's going on with seagrass in some of Florida, particularly the southeast coast, it's in real trouble in some places. There are also natural breakwaters, just like the salt marsh and the mangrove areas. They stabilize shorelines and help catch sediment. And all these things sequester CO2 to some extent, but because oysters make shells of calcium carbonate, they're actually reducing CO2 by taking some of that CO2 out of the air and adding it to their shells and sequestering it there. So, more oysters are obviously going to be better in many ways. They provide habitat. Over 300 species, including fish and invertebrates, use this. And they're also nursery and food habitat for more fish. So all these things are important for our fish species. So we all live in Florida. We know what's been going on. And I'm moving on to the slide because we talked about natural systems, but now I want to talk about what's happening to natural systems. And so this is a slide about population growth in Florida from 1900 to 2019. And you can see the number here. In 1900, there were 530,000 people in the state. And as of 2019, we had over 21 million. And we're growing at, 900 to 1,000 people a day in Florida. And so we've, I think, in my opinion, kind of reached critical mass already with the number of people here, but people are not going to stop moving here. Another thing to think about when you think about population growth is that almost 80% of everybody that moves to Florida lives in a coastal area or close to the coast. And then when you combine that with sea level rise and the increased incidence in dramatic weather events, it's a problem. We've had 13 climate and weather disasters in 8 years between 2010 and 2018. And that doesn't count, that's 2-year-old data, so that doesn't count anything from the last 2 years. So what happened? Well, one of the things that happened, because so many people love to come here, and because of the way Florida is developed, we've got a lot of shoreline habitat loss. And so some examples, Tampa Bay, more than 40% of the mangrove and salt marsh acreage was lost since 1940. But I do want to say that Tampa Bay has an amazing program for working on their seagrass issues. And so even though it's a big city, they've been working really hard. Lake Worth, 51% decrease in salt marsh acreage in Palm Beach County. And honestly, till I saw this number, I didn't even really know that Lake Worth had salt marsh in it between 1944 and 1982. And then Duval County, this is along the St. Johns River. There's been a lot of dredge and fill activity going along up there. And so they've lost 36% of their marsh habitat since 1943. And down in my area, the Indian River Lagoon, 80% decline in oyster populations. And that mirrors the global loss in oysters, which is 85%. So we've got real trouble when it comes to oyster reef populations all over the world. And also 86% of our mangrove areas in the Indian River Lagoon, it's not that they're gone, it's that they're closed off to actually being connected to the lagoon because of this idea of flooding them, impounding them, and flooding them for mosquito control. And so those areas might still be there, but they're basically closed to a certain amount of the animal population since the 1940s. And so they're not fully able to do their thing like they should be in terms of providing, habitat for fish. So one of the other things people like to do, they obviously, want to live near the coast and they don't want their house to go in the water. So they harden shorelines. And there's some numbers here which are really shocking to say the least. Continental US, 14% of the shore is already hardened. That equates with almost 13,000 miles of coastline that's now covered in concrete. 66% of that is in the South Atlantic and the Gulf Coast. And also, people are continuing to do this because climate change is in the news, sea level rise is in the news. And so that number is going up. And estimation by NOAA, I find this really scary, says that by 2100, a third of all the coastlines in the US will be armored. Is that a good idea? I don't know. Maybe you guys think about it and chat and discuss that. But there are some alternatives. So there are things called living shorelines versus hardened shorelines. Hardened shorelines are things like seawalls or riprap you see in this picture. Both of those things. The piece of concrete in the foreground is a seawall that's about to fall into the lagoon. And then there's some riprap further back there, which is also trying to stabilize that shoreline. And if you think about why do people decide to do this? Because it doesn't look real good, for one thing. It doesn't have much in the way of environmental function. But look at the Restore America's Estuaries quote: landowners continue to use hardened shoreline protections because they're familiar with those methods, and they lack information about the shortcomings and the relative advantages of living shorelines. So a lot of people put in seawalls, and that's sort of an issue mainly because it creates this really abrupt transition between deep water and dry land. So, when we talked about natural systems having connectivity between uplands to the marsh area and then into this, to the water, that's what you see in the top figure. That kind of connectivity is broken when you add something like a seawall. So you have this dramatic drop off. There's not really much in the way of habitat for anything to live on this. And seawalls actually have a scouring effect on the bottom. And so when the wave comes in and hits the seawall and then projects downward, it sort of digs a hole at the foot of the seawall, allowing sand from behind it to flow out into the waterway. And then those seawalls can collapse. And that's what you saw happening in that earlier photo that I showed. And I'll show you that photo again in context. So there are some alternatives, green to gray shorelines. If you want to look at this graphic in greater detail, you can go to the Habitat Blueprint at noaa.gov, and you'll find this, as well as a lot of other information about living shorelines. But green or soft shoreline techniques are better in many cases than the gray, harder techniques. There are situations where you just cannot use a living shoreline. So for example, if you had a really high energy coastline where, say, vegetation only or even vegetation plus an oyster reef wouldn't work, then you're going to need something else. There are hybrid systems, but I can't go too deeply in the time that we have into the use for each one of these. But I will say, if you look at the left side of this, low energy environments can use this vegetation only sort of living shoreline. And places with a little bit more wave energy that have oysters naturally can use that combination of oyster reefs and vegetation. So how do they stack up? This is a really interesting graphic, and this is actually from Florida Fish and Wildlife Service. And so it's talking about traditional erosion control or those hardened structures versus living shorelines. And you can see that there's pluses in the column for living shorelines, and in the column for traditional erosion control, the minuses indicate that that erosion control is not providing these other benefits. So the hardened shorelines don't maintain ecosystem processes. They don't improve water quality or decrease nutrient runoff. They don't become more stable over time like living shorelines do. They cannot adapt to sea level rise because they're static. And they don't protect, restore, and enhance wildlife habitat, which I think is one of the things that's important to all of us as Floridians. And they also exacerbate our water quality issues, sediment and pollutants and nutrient runoff. All of those things are not caught by these traditional erosion control methods. And so living shoreline benefits, you can read these, but basically most of these come directly out of the benefits provided by natural systems. So coastal resiliency, stability over time, erosion protection, reduction of wave energy. But there's some other things. They can outperform hardened shorelines during a storm. They can reduce property loss in some cases. I mean, none of these things are like, you know, in every case we can say this for sure. But the photo here is really interesting because this is along the Indian River Lagoon in Jensen Beach. And if you look in the background of this photo, you can see that the neighbors here had a revetment. And you can see that there's like a nice little sand beach happening right here behind this Spartina. And there's an oyster reef. And so this area is actually accruing sand behind the living shoreline. And that's one of the things that these living shorelines can do. And so instead of the wave energy coming in here and sort of dragging the sand away, it's allowing the sand to come up through the plants and to collect on the beach. And this shoreline has been through some storms already, and it waxes and wanes a little bit because in the wintertime the grass is a little more sparse. But this has been really, really successful at protecting this property owner's shoreline. And there's also access for people to get down here in a kayak, and there's a dock. And so this can also work. You still want to be able to use your waterfront. So how do we get there? One of the things I'm working on is to try to come up with a living shorelines roadmap that would help homeowners figure this out, because I talked to a lot of people, it seems to be kind of a mystery. What you're looking at looks a little complicated, but basically everything in here that is in the aqua color is something that the homeowner is going to be doing. And then the things that are green are something their restoration professionals would be doing or their team would be doing. And so if you're thinking about doing this, the first thing you want to do is to learn about what options you have. And so in order to do that, you're probably going to have to do a little bit of research online or call up a local expert. And so that might be somebody from Sea Grant, like your extension agent from Sea Grant or IFAS. It could be if you have a nonprofit, like we have a nonprofit that does some living shorelines work in Martin County, and you can call that person up and get some ideas about what can be done on your shoreline. So can you have a nature-based system, or do you need a hybrid system? And what can you do there? Do you have oysters there already? So can you have an oyster reef? So learn about your options, and then try to determine what your project goals are. So if you have an erosion problem, you need to be able to talk to your team that you're going to put together about that. If you want to improve your habitat, so for example, if you want to see more wildlife on your shoreline and you want mangroves, make sure to tell these people that that's what you want. Do you want to enhance your view with the natural elements, or is there something else? And so once you jot down some of your project goals, or maybe even sketch some things out, then it's time to put your team together. And there might be a lot of different team members. There might only be one or two, but depending on your situation, you might end up with a biologist or ecologist, a local professional. You might have a landscape architect that's going to do stuff on the shoreline, but also work with your uplands piece, or a landscape designer. You might have a marine contractor, a builder, an engineer, or even some other people, depending on the scope of your project. And so once you get your team together, in that yellow block in the middle, share your project goals with your team. That's super important, because there are a lot of people out there, contractors you might call on, who don't necessarily know how to do this. And there's a tendency, I think, on the part of a lot of people to try to sell these hardened shoreline solutions, and it might just be because these folks don't know yet that this is an option. And so it's up to you as a homeowner or a property owner to make sure that if you can have a living shoreline, that your team, gives you the option of doing it. Once you talk to them about what you want, they're going to start working. They're going to analyze your site. Some of the considerations are going to be, what's the slope and the elevation, what kind of erosion is there, what kind of wave energy, and so on. And is it suitable for oysters and mangroves? They'll create a budget and a timeline, and they're going to create some kind of a site sketch, because that's needed for the permit process. And you're going to get to approve those things. And once you approve them, then you get to go into the construction part, where they source the materials and plants. And it's really important to get your plants from local sources. There are permits involved. They come generally from Department of Environmental Protection, Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and also from the Army Corps of Engineers, but DEP handles the Army Corps permit. So this does not have to be a stress point for anybody. Once your permit comes through, they can start building it, and I'm going to show some slides about some of how things get built. But before you start actually constructing the living shoreline, there's some site prep that has to happen. And then after everything's done, you want to monitor the project. So that's to make sure that the materials are stable. You might need to add some new plants. You want to monitor the grass growth, obviously keep track of what kind of wildlife and oyster recruitment is happening, and whether sand is accreting, and just what's going on out there. And then you want to share your progress with others, your project success in particular with others, because the more people that create living shorelines in Florida, the more benefit we're going to be able to get from them, and the fewer problems we're going to have with these hardened shorelines. So here's a living shoreline in action. This is on Joe Raines Beach. And if you go up to Cedar Key, this is a public beach you can visit, and you can see this thing, and it's really amazing. I wanted to put this slide on here because it has all the components of a living shoreline. So the key living components of Florida's living shorelines are oyster reefs, mangroves, and salt marshes. And you can see all of those in this particular slide. So offshore, there's an orange dot that says oyster reef, and that's that dark line. So the salt marsh area, Spartina alterniflora, that's a Spartina grass that can cope with tidal inundation. So that's going to have water up in there part of the day. And that's super habitat for little fiddler crabs. When I was out on this beach this day, there were thousands, just little fiddler crabs by the thousands running through this grass. It was really cool. So further back from there is another kind of Spartina patens, which grows a little more upslope, and then mangroves. And in the case of this particular shoreline, I believe that this is white mangrove, but there are some red mangroves coming into some of these areas naturally. As our climate changes, red mangrove is moving northward into some of these salt marsh areas. When we looked at the first slide, this is a different location, but you see these curved structures, and these are bagged oysters. And there's different ways of building oyster reefs, but the way that we're using in the lagoon is, in the southern lagoon anyway, is we're taking bags and filling them with loose oyster shell that was collected from local restaurants and repurposed. And so this oyster shell is collected from restaurants, and then it's taken and seasoned so that any bacteria or any organisms that are on it will be eliminated. And once it's nice and clean, then volunteers get together and they bag this stuff up. So the oyster shell is kept out of the landfill, and it becomes a really important part of building these reefs to get more oysters to grow. So having said that, is if you have a shoreline that doesn't have oysters naturally, you don't want to use these oyster shell based elements. You want to use something else. And this little diagram that shows the curve effect it's kind of interesting that one of the reasons this was done in the shape is just aesthetics, so that this looks better instead of just being in a straight line. But you'll notice that these are grouped with open spaces in between. And the reason that that is the case is you want to be able to have, you want to be able to transit that. So like if you wanted to take your kayak out there, you want to be able to go through this reef. But it's also so at high tide, say a manatee swims up in here, you don't want a manatee to get stuck behind one of these things, or fish, and the tide goes out and then you have these animals being stranded. So you have to construct these so animals can transit in and out of these spaces. And also so the sand can come up in here in between these and then get behind them and accrue. And we talked about the Spartina grass. This photo on the right, this is Dr. Mark Clark. He's with UF at the Nature Coast Biological Station up in Cedar Key. And he's holding a little piece of Spartina alterniflora, and you can see this huge root system that's on this tiny little plant. And that really brings to the forefront in terms of how these can help hold the sediment in place and also withstand these tidal situations and storm situations that come in. So these guys are really good at staying in place. And so that's the plant that's in that low marsh region that tolerates inundation. In the photo on the left, that's the same plant. This is a different site. I believe this is in the St. Lucie River down in Martin County, and they're getting ready to plant the shoreline out. They've got plants in pots and they're setting them out right there. The last component that I'm going to talk about is red mangroves. Mangroves, sometimes when you talk to homeowners, mangroves they have concerns about this plant because there's a lot of baggage surrounding trimming it and what you can and can't do with this under state guidelines. But I want to emphasize how important this plant is to living shorelines, and that just having a few mangroves doesn't necessarily have to impede your view if that's what you're concerned about. But this plant is one of the best erosion preventers and stabilizers of land that you could put in. So even if you had a seawall, if you have room, you could retrofit your seawall with some riprap, and then you could plant mangroves on that riprap, in that riprap, and you are allowed to trim them within state guidelines. And so there are ways to deal with this. So that earlier shoreline I showed you with all the beautiful Spartina grass accruing sand behind it, that particular landowner wanted to have their view preserved, but they did put mangroves out on the end margins. And so they're going to get some of that functionality, but then they're still able to have their view out the center. These tangled root systems prevent erosion. It helps prevent your shoreline from getting damaged from storm winds and waves. There's lots of habitat. It's got that water filtering capability. Some new things people are trying is planting these within the oyster reef structure, and that's what you're looking at here. So again, look in the background of this photo and you'll see there's like a couple of concrete structures back there. This is a stormwater outfall from a road that's up on a bluff above the Indian River Lagoon. So fresh water is coming out there periodically, and that's actually really good for these oysters, because they don't want as much salinity as regular saltwater. So having some fresh water come in there is good for them. And you'll notice that the shoreline behind here is basically eroded back pretty far. And while this is out, and this is going to accrue some sand and hopefully build out a little bit. And so living shorelines don't have to just be for estuaries. They can also be for lakes and ponds. And I found this number, and I was just astounded at, and I don't know what year this was, but 76,000 stormwater ponds statewide. I think it's a fairly recent number from a U.S. study. That's kind of amazing. These stormwater ponds were used for flood control and water treatment, but they're in a lot of HOAs, and many times what you see is these things with grass going right down to the edge of the pond. And so when people come along and they fertilize their yard, or the HOA fertilizes common areas, that fertilizer, it's a lot easier for the fertilizer, even if you don't fertilize to the edge, which technically you're not supposed to do. But the fertilizer can get into these ponds, and there's no edge vegetation to uptake the nutrients, and so they get more and more eutrophic, and eventually they're going to get full of algae and they're going to smell bad and just be really nasty. So it's super important to add aquatic plants and edge plantings to these things. And those aquatic plants are going to provide this, these freshwater organisms, the same kinds of things that we talked about, with our mangroves and our salt marsh. Support for insects, snails, fish, migrating waterfowl. They do that same functionality where they improve water quality by taking up nutrients. They reduce erosion on the edge, and they try, help keep some of the sediment from going down into the bottom of your pond and filling it up and making it mucky. And they also can take up some of the chemical pollutants and keep them out of lakes and ponds, because these ponds are designed for flood control, because they collect stormwater and put it back into the groundwater. But if it goes back in pretty quickly, they can exchange some of that pollution with the groundwater. And, some of us are drinking groundwater. Actually, a lot of us are drinking groundwater. Not everybody's drinking water out of the aquifer. So the more of that we can keep out of these ponds, the better. If you look at this graphic, some of the plants that you can plant, and this brown line is the slope. And when you're planting, you have to be really cognizant of the depth of these things, because not every plant likes to live in the same depth of water. And so that's part of what they're showing you here, that, horsetail, for example, wants to be a little further upslope, as does iris, but things like pickerelweed can be out a little further, and then in the deeper zone, you can have water lily and spatterdock and things like that. These same techniques can be used in freshwater environments. So this high marsh area, there's a lot of plants that can be used in there. So, like if you go out on, any beach, basically, I was up in St. Mark's, you'll see different kinds of plants up in there. I don't know about sea lavender, but glasswort certainly. And then when there's a lot of different plants, I don't have them in this presentation, that would fall in this kind of high marsh area. And also, just above that. But basically in the low marsh where it's flooded, we're using Spartina alterniflora is basically it. I mean, for the most part.
Joanna would like to know, could you navigate the roadmap without the help of professionals and with proper research/resources and an understanding of the permit system?
Okay, so a do-it-yourself living shoreline. So that's an interesting question. And of all the people I've been talking to, I have encountered one person who is thinking about going it alone, and you absolutely can do that. So if this person that is interested in going it alone is a biologist and has a lot of knowledge and is familiar with the permit system and feels confident that, he's going to be able to navigate this. And so I think if you are really interested in doing this, you certainly could. And if you want to do a DIY, I would recommend, talking, like I said, talk to some local professional like Sea Grant IFAS. If there's an extension agent in your area, that's a good place to start. You can get a lot of information from them, and then you can certainly go your own way. The permit process is all online. There's a lot of information on there already, and there's even information on I think it's on the DEP website, that talks about the requirements for the site sketch and how that can be done. And one of the things with a permit is it does take a while. And so if there's something missing from your permit, then that slows everything down, because they'll come back to you and say they need more stuff, and you have to give them whatever they need. And then, it's going to kind of go around and around and around. So, but I think it is possible, although it would be difficult. And if you're thinking about doing an oyster reef, that might be the hardest part.
Carla has a question back in your design slide. You had the curvy design slide. I think it was an oyster reef.
That one?
Yes, that one. So she says it had a straight line between the salt marsh and beach areas. Why was it designed this way?
Oh, so like in the Cedar Key shot. So yeah, that's an interesting question. So this is a single line of bags in here, and so basically what they're doing with this is they're really using this as what's called a sill. And so this particular shoreline faces open water, and so there's a huge amount of erosion going on in here. And so this was installed to try to protect this vegetation. And it isn't very high. And so there's also things that you can't see just by looking at these photos about the height of these oyster reefs off the bottom. So this is in pretty shallow water. And in fact, I think it may only be 1 bag deep. And then further offshore, which you can't see because the tide's in, there's some other structures in deeper water that are a little bit taller. And this reef isn't very tall either, but sometimes these would be further out and they would be in deeper water, and they would be, their height would be different. And so that's when these openings get to be more critical.
Rory would like to know what the bags are made of.
Right now, so this is an issue right now. Right now, the bags that are being used are like a plastic mesh. And there's ongoing research that is going to find another solution to this. Right now I know plastic's an issue, but frankly, there's not that many of these bags being put out. And in the greater scheme of things, I think the oysters encapsulate these pretty quickly. And so not a lot of this material is getting loose. That's not to say it can't get loose eventually, but we're talking about a very small amount of this material going into the water. But there is an effort to try to replace these with something that's biodegradable. And I think that before very long, there's going to be a requirement, if there isn't already, to not use plastic. I know that, the people I'm working with are basically looking for other ways to bag this stuff up. There's a lot of different ways you can handle oysters, but one of the things that's important with bagging them is this reusing the shell and keeping it out of the landfill. And also the fact that this bag system makes this really easy to deploy. So volunteers are elicited to do this work, and it really gets a lot of people involved, where some of the other oyster structures have to be barged in, and they have to have heavy equipment. We don't like the bags, but I think for right now it's working really well, and there's going to be a solution to this plastic issue before very long.
Thank you, Marjorie. Carla would like to know how you keep plantings around stormwater ponds and natural ponds from filling up with muck and organic matter.
Well, I think that's part of the process. And so it's partly decaying vegetation, I would imagine. And if the pond is balanced, then, I have a goldfish pond out back. And when my water is balanced and there's enough beneficial bacteria and enough plants in there, it's in balance, and so it keeps that stuff to a minimum. And so a lot of these stormwater ponds they're unbalanced. And so you are going to have a certain amount of muck accruing over time, because, really muck is partly sand, and then a certain amount of organic matter. And so I don't know that there is a way around that, but the vegetation should actually help that and not make it worse.
Chris would like to know, are permits needed to add a few shoreline plants in stormwater ponds, which is not exactly your area of expertise or work on this?
I don't know about it. I think it depends on where the pond is. So for example, and you'll have to look into this, but a lot of these stormwater ponds, are requirements of the state when things get developed. So like if you have a pond, say in an HOA, or a pond at a company someplace, that might not actually belong to the property owners. Some of them are state ponds, and so I think it depends on who owns it. But I believe if you have a pond on your own property, then I don't think you have to have a permit. But I'm not 100% sure, because I don't really deal that much with ponds.
Deborah Curry, Marion Big Scrub Chapter, says, is there a resource to make the oyster beds?
So what do you mean by a resource?
Now that I can see what the bags look like, I was just trying to figure out if there was something else, like a rayon or some other natural source that we could use to make them and create them.
Yeah, there's some stuff going on. I was just talking to somebody at ORCA, Ocean Research and Conservation Association, and they didn't really tell me too much about it, but I know that there's work going on for a biodegradable material, and I don't know what it is. I know that I'm fooling around a little bit with a way to, I can't talk about that either right now, but to kind of get around this bag issue. And also some people are taking things like burlap and encapsulating them with some concrete material so that oysters can be put inside. I don't know of any product. The biggest problem right now is that in order for the bags to have oysters recruit on them, they have to stay together for a certain amount of time, because if the bag breaks open and the oyster shell falls out, gets loose, it gets covered with sand, and then the oyster spat can't get on there and they can't form the reef. So the stuff has to stay together, long enough for the oysters to get all over this and to recruit, and eventually this becomes kind of monolithic, and the plastic material gets encapsulated inside of it. And so it's not really out there if there's successful colonization on this material. So I don't have a real answer for it. I know that basically all I can tell you is there's ongoing work on that.
And remark about the seagrasses, if he goes to Moat Aquaculture in Sarasota, they've been working on seagrasses there a lot with success.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't really been delving into the seagrass piece of it too much, because that isn't something that homeowners are going to be able to work with. I know that in some places, if you had a permit to work with seagrass, maybe they're adding seagrass to some of these things, but the average person doesn't have a permit to work with seagrass.
Tim asks, even where there is some riprap, can the shoreline still be extended outward to provide habitat for other species, including horseshoe crab nesting area?
Yeah, so Tim, I'm assuming you're talking about adding some sand. So anything you do in the water has to be permitted, and I think that just becomes a permit issue. So I can't really answer that. I know that. So if you look at this picture on the left, this is a private residence, and this is the one, you can see where the house is, and their lawn, they don't have much space. And then they've got the slope, which is, pretty abrupt, and they've got this riprap going, and then over here they've just got a seawall. And so when I looked at this, I asked the person I was with, who deals with a lot of permitting issues, can't, just what you asked, basically, can't they do a living shoreline on this? And the answer was, it depends on where this, so this is in the aquatic preserve in the Indian River Lagoon. So to get a permit to add on, slope to this probably wouldn't happen. And there's not enough room back here to do anything. That's really a question that's beyond the scope of my knowledge, first of all. And also, I think it sort of enters into location specific kinds of things. And then also, I'm not claiming any knowledge of the permitting process at all. So I can't really say very much, about that. That's really useful and intelligent.
Vincent in Comio, who you're working with, right, Marjorie?
Yeah, hi, Vincent.
Yes. He says, on the seagrass question, there are anecdotal reports of shoaling caused by living shoreline oyster reefs, facilitating seagrass recruitment, but some of these events were transitory. There's a modeling study that shows oyster filtration is capable of facilitating seagrass growth by clearing the water, allowing sunlight to reach the grass, but this is only a modeling study.
Okay, cool. So I think that did a really good job answering the question about seagrass recruitment.
And that's all the questions in the chat right now. Anything else you want to say, Marjorie?
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for participating and listening to this topic, because I think it's super important that everybody knows about this, even if you don't live on the water. There's some volunteer opportunities to get involved, and if you have an opportunity to get involved with one of them, jump on it, because it's a lot of fun. And also, I wish I had more information on ponds, and like Valerie said, we probably need to do another talk about that, because that seems to be a really hot topic for members.
Thank you everyone for coming to this Lunch and Learn, and I hope to see you on next week's Lunch and Learn.
Thanks, everybody.